Hello and welcome everyone to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup for Friday, March 8th, 2024. Ron Quaranta, chair of the WSBA, here with my co-host, the amazing Josh Klayman, also a member of the board as well as the chair of our legal working group. We have our special guest coming up, attorney and author Michelle Gitlitz. She's running a little behind, so she'll be joining us shortly. Shout out to our friend David Brill, who I believe is on assignment, which might mean walking on a beach someplace in Florida, Josh. I'm not particularly sure. But David, we'll be back next week. We miss you, buddy. Before we begin, the usual disclaimers. Obviously, keep in mind that nothing discussed should be accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice. And then anything that Josh or I or our guests discuss is really our opinions, not necessarily the opinions or views of our relative firms. Happy Friday, Josh. Good to see you.
Great to see you too, Ron. How's it going?
Keeping busy as always. There's so much to talk about, and we've got a little bit of our agenda. It's funny, every time Bitcoin goes up 5,000 or crosses a new all-time high and then falls off the cliff, I get a blizzard of text messages from colleagues saying, this is great, and another bunch of colleagues saying, I told you so. Look, it's falling again. Let's kick it off, Josh. There's been some really interesting news, and I'd love your opinion and perspective on it. Something that's come out recently was the Shapeshift judgment that we had seen. For those of you who may not remember, back in the day, Shapeshift was a platform that allowed the buying and selling of crypto. They pivoted their business model to a DAO. Josh, remind me, probably 2021, I think it was. And this settlement really represented this really de minimis amount of money for a business that's no longer doing what the regulator said it was doing. And there's almost the question of, well what was the point of this settlement? And there were dissents as well that I thought were really interesting. Josh, what did you think of the settlement?
So what I would say is you've hit the nail on the head, Ron, which is, it was interesting to me that this is focusing on activity that occurred a long time ago. I mean, maybe not a long time ago if you look back at the history of the United States, but if you look back, the activity that was alleged to have occurred, it says ended in, I believe, 2021, right? We're in 2024. And on one hand, I do think that this does show that it takes time for cases and for enforcement actions to work their way through the system, so to speak. And so perhaps this was begun a long time ago and it's only seeing the light of day now. I should note, of course, there was no admission or of liability or anything like that. It's structured as a cease and desist proceedings, which is interesting because, again, the activity was in the past. But what I do wonder, and I wonder this for a lot of reasons, but one of the things I wonder about is whether this is one of the SEC's intended, if I put my mind for a moment in the thoughts of what a regulator could be thinking, of where it is not a teachable moment exactly, but where the activity has already stopped and it's trying to send a message. So one of the things I thought was very interesting is in the lead-in to the actual cease and desist order, perhaps not the lead-in, but at the beginning of the summary, Shapeshift was described by the SEC as acting as a market maker for these assets by serving as the counterparty to every transaction, marketing itself as a crypto vending machine. Shapeshift generated revenues by affecting exchanges with customers at an exchange rate favorable to Shapeshift, generally by charging its customers more for the crypto assets than it paid to acquire them through the spread on its customer transactions. One of the things that I think about this is the calling out and the specifically naming Shapeshift as characterization as a market maker. I think that market makers, the SEC has been looking at quite closely, and we've seen this in certain cases that are unfolding in courts. But I do think that this is intended to send a message about activities.
Josh, thanks so much. Let's welcome our guest, the one, the only Michelle Gitlitz. For the record, for anyone in the audience, if you're inviting someone to your broadcast, make sure you send them the link. That's kind of important. Michelle, great to see you. Say hello to the audience. Please tell them who you are and what you do.
Oh, thank you so much, Ron, and thanks, Josh, for inviting me. I'm so lucky and privileged to be here. I'm Michelle Gitlitz. I am a lawyer and advisor in the crypto and payment space. have been in this space for almost 10 years now, along with both of you, almost the entire time, which has been great. I focus a lot on payment issues and the transmission of assets, but I am a recovering securities lawyer, so all of these, the Shapeshift action, the default judgment, and the Wahi case, this is all very exciting stuff for us to talk about today. I also recently published a book called Reimagining Payments, the Business Case for Digital Currencies.
Show us the book.
I'll just show everyone a little copy of the book. This is not a legal book. It is a practical and tactical guide to thinking about how we can potentially transact better using digital currencies rather than credit cards with really high fees, et cetera.
Yep. Michelle, great to have you. You beat me to it. I was definitely going to raise the book. And for our colleagues in the audience, it's a book worth getting. Please do. And for everyone else watching on LinkedIn and on X, thank you so much for joining us. If you have questions for Josh or for Michelle, please put them in the chat. We'll try to address them throughout the broadcast. Michelle, as you probably saw, Josh and I kind of dove right into Shapeshift. One of the things, you both know I'm not an attorney, but one of the things that struck me was they don't allege harm. Am I misreading that? And what were your thoughts? Michelle, what are your thoughts about that settlement?
I think that it's shocking in a couple of ways because it's sort of inexplicable. It seems very much to me that a $275,000 penalty for fairly robust activities. It almost reminds me of me perhaps why others in the industry settle with the SEC rather than go through a long drag out fight, is that the factual allegations that were agreed to and the violations that were agreed to and the penalty that was assessed are relatively small in relation to the fact that the platform has changed its business model. And I view this as the SEC puts a quasi notch in its belt. And I say quasi because I don't think that this particular consent has much value to the ecosystem of sending any particular message. I don't read this consent and say, oh, now I understand better what's allowed and what's not allowed. Right. I more read this as this was a pretty inexpensive way to end what was probably a protracted investigation.
Michelle, Go ahead, Josh. Absolutely.
Oh, I was just going to say, I agree with Michelle. And I do think, I think when I was thinking of, quote, a teachable moment, I was thinking for a moment about the Dow report, right? And how the SEC has said, look, we have it out there. Like, this is this is the line in the sand. Whereas here, again, the activity occurred so long ago. The penalty is small. Who suffered harm and things like that. I agree. I think this is the thing that will perhaps fall under the line item of here's when you know that there is a dealer. Right.
Josh, Michelle, thank you so much. I'm gonna let's peel back the layers of that a little bit. One of the other things that really caught my eye, and certainly a lot of colleagues in the industry have brought this up. When you look at the settlement, the SEC was unclear even about what was listed that they would consider to be illegal, or even the logic of why they would claim that. And in fairness, the SEC has put forward in the past that several, maybe a couple of dozen, or I'm probably misremembering, certain tokens were securities, but they're absolutely silent on that here. Why? Is that kind of the idea that, well, because we're saying the broad market are all securities, or was it just that for the expediency of settling this case? Why wouldn't they note what they were doing that was illegal?
My guess is because it's totally unclear what is illegal, and that to actually articulate that is something that is not in the SEC's benefit to give that clarity. I think the dissent, and I love that Commissioner Peirce is really getting joined by another commissioner now more frequently than we have seen in the past, which I think is a very important message that she has an ally. And I think that's part of, what the dissent was saying is there's absolutely the factual basis is missing.
Yeah. And I think along with that, I think it was Commissioner Uyeda who was joining with Commissioner Peirce on that. I think what was said about, there was like a sample commentary of what could be the back and forth between, an entity and the commission. I think what is said about how this leaves transactions and secondary market transactions in particular in limbo. I mean, this is something not only that is important for any really situation, but we know that the secondary market, and I think it's no mistake that in the description of Shapeshift, they talk about the reselling, right? The vending machine that's getting to the secondary market transactions, because those secondary market transactions and whether they may be involve in the event that the tokens or the transactions involve securities, whether the secondary market ones should be treated differently, and where, if anywhere, is there a limiting principle. We've seen this come up in multiple cases recently, and I think Michelle's point about, and your point about not even calling out the digital assets, that the 79 crypto assets, how many of those or which ones were securities or involved securities transactions is important.
Josh, Michelle, thanks so much. I think, for those in the audience, you both referenced both the decision and the dissent. The dissent is certainly both worth reading. The dissent was masterful, and I think the sentence that jumped out for me was the conclusion, which was, cases like this do not protect investors. They intimidate innovators and entrepreneurs. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Oh, 100%. Except for one piece, is that I think it sends a message that if the SEC believes that you are wrong, that potentially there is a relatively small penalty compared to the amount that you have made in off of your platform or off of your token sale, that there is some smaller percentage of your profits that you will pay to dispose of an action. And so when you think about the cost benefit, maybe people will read the settlement and say that wasn't a bad deal.
Right. It reminds me of some of the settlements we've seen in the past where it seemed to be so small relative to the alleged amount of money made. But Josh, do you want to wrap that up a little bit before we move on to another topic?
So no surprise here. I agree with Michelle. I do think, though, one thing I would just say is, again, there was no admission of liability here. And so I think that is important. That kind of goes hand in hand. They didn't allege any particular tokens, right? They didn't prove that any particular tokens were securities. So I do think that it is an interesting one for sure.
I've got the benefit of two great legal minds here, so I want to bring up the other case that popped up on the radar this week. And when it came out, it was interesting, the Coinbase default judgment that we all saw in the news. And again, we all have colleagues that are kind of in the crypto blockchain ecosystem that are critical and important. We still have what I call my legacy colleagues who still think, crypto is imaginary and all of this interesting stuff. But those detractors came back and often would say, well, oh, look, another win for the regulator in this case. Michelle, it wasn't quite that simple. Tell us a little bit about that default judgment. What was your take on it?
Well, Ron, when you say a win, yes, if I show up to a tennis match and my opponent doesn't show up, right. I technically won, but I didn't actually play, right? It had nothing to do with my abilities. I'll take the win, as the SEC does, but I can't represent that I beat my opponent, fair and square, because my opponent didn't show up. And so I think what's interesting is how the SEC is attempting to use that default judgment as a sword.
Right. Josh, weigh in on this. And, one of the things we often talk about when we look at these cases and these settlements and how these are kind of finalized, you get the sense that the SEC is building on some very tiny wins, a case. their precedent that they can point to. Josh, am I misremembering? Am I misinterpreting that?
No, I don't think you're misinterpreting it or misremembering it at all. I mean, I do have to say, in terms of having something on the books, right, that they can point to about saying, oh, secondary market transactions, right? That's one thing. But as Michelle noted, if the other player isn't playing, then yes, you won. But you were pushing. I think someone made a post. I won't use the name, but made a post saying, yes, it's pushing against a completely open door, right? And so I think that is an important way to look at it. And I think that's also, we have to remember, like, yes, a default judgment, it's not, in my view, going to have the same, persuasive effect or the same it's not going to be, have the same precedential effect that another type of case would have. And I think when we think about the adversarial process and what that is supposed to help us do in terms of finding the contours or seeing better the contours of the law, this doesn't really advance the ball. It just advances one argument.
Yeah, and this kind of conversation or the concern, you often see it in, I don't want to say the phrase mainstream media, but when you see it in the media sources that maybe aren't directly plugged into a lot of the things the three of us see in crypto and blockchain, it's another win, another win. It really needs to be taken in context. It also needs to be taken in the context of when you look at the different district courts, looking at some of the different cases, they're not bound by some of this, correct?
No, they're not. I mean, they're certainly not bound by it outside of, in any way that a lawyer would want to use, a case from Georgia to be persuasive in a court in Texas. This is a district court decision. It has no precedential value in outside of that particular court, and even within that court, I'm not sure how much authority it really has, particularly because it was a default.
Right.
Yeah, and even for cases that are not defaults, like if we think back to the Ripple decision, and then Terraform Labs decisions, both of those orders on summary judgment. Judge Rakoff wasn't bound by the reasoning of Judge Torres. And so, yes, we have these cases. Imagine now that there was a completely unopposed case, say in the Southern District, right? How much persuasive effect would that have if even the judges now, have within the Southern District can have very different reasonings? Query whether they would follow the reasoning in the default judgment.
Yep. So in the midst of these cases and the stuff we talk about from a legal perspective, of course, it's been a busy week in the markets. My phone, I'm sure both of your phones blew up with the alerts. Bitcoin crossed 70,000 and everyone's screaming about meme coins and all of these other tokens. David and I often talk about markets and the impact that we're seeing, particularly from a macroeconomic perspective. I want to ask you both from the perspective of the work you do in this space. And Michelle, including payments, if we can weave that into the discussion, what's your take on the kind of this inflection point of being out of crypto winter? And when you see these prices, is it generating interest from clients? Is it generating the idea that, the builders keep building and we're moving forward? Michelle, let's start with you. What are you seeing in the marketplace when you look at all-time highs?
I'm seeing a lot of excitement, a lot more deal flow, to be honest, and more, and this time more sophisticated deal flow. I mean, bigger companies doing deals with more established entities. In the payment space, we see a lot of integrations, a lot of ways to use and pay for crypto, a lot of new wallets and wallet integrations, and making things easier. I think one of the pain points, particularly in payments, is you want to be able to pay for things easily. People love Apple Pay, tap and click, those types of things. Does the average person know how the technology works in the background? Generally, no. But with crypto, when you have to remember your seed phrases and do all these steps to actually effectuate transactions, what excites me, particularly in the payment space, is businesses and projects making it easier. using email addresses, using biotechnology to facilitate transactions without having to remember your private keys. And so builders building, but really, really interesting, true financial services offerings. And so what I'm hearing is not just about, I want to build a token. I want, my DAO to be successful. I think I can do it in Wyoming, but maybe I should do it in the British Virgin Islands. It's really, how can I help the average US and international consumer transact with this asset class?
Michelle,
And
go ahead. Sorry.
And just one final thing, in 2024, everybody knows the words Bitcoin and Ethereum. Even in the last bull run, people still, that didn't roll off their tongues the way that it does now.
Right. Michelle, really great points. Josh, weigh in on this. And I'm assuming the deal flow you're getting, the business you're getting are not two kids in the basement trying to launch an ICO. Are you seeing the same things?
Yeah. I mean, I believe that there's been, certainly, sorry, there's a small emergency in my house. It sounds like it's plumbing. We'll
It
investigate
happens
that later. but what I would say is, yes, in terms of excitement and in terms of people who maybe have been sitting on the sidelines and moving in, I think that there's a lot of meaningful movement. I think that deals that have been contemplated for a while, people are moving forward on. And I think, part of it is, for folks that are sitting on top of a lot of, frankly, Bitcoin, this means that they're a lot more flush, right? They have a lot more capital that they can deploy. And I would say, even with respect to what you said, Ron, about, the volatility, the volatility bands that we're seeing. I think I just checked a few moments ago, and again, not investment advice or anything like that, but I think it's at like over 68,000 right now. So this up and down to 62 or whatever, up to 68, at least for now, the bands are so far above where they've been. I think this is, it's not going to be static or just a completely smooth, nothing is, right? If you think about, the S&P, like all these sorts of things, there's going to be retreats, there's going to be moves, not to compare Bitcoin to a security, but
careful.
But anyway, exactly. But yeah, I think it's a very exciting time. And I would say that's at the institutional level, but also even for digital native projects and teams where, again, like a lot of times assets that are held, they are in the form of digital assets. So to the extent that there is more, that those have greater buying power, it's going to have a positive move. By the way, I just want to say, I hope at some point on this, like Michelle, I would love to know your takeaways. Like, I don't want to like give away your book, right? But what you were saying about some of your ideas, like it would be really great to hear more about that. If you're,
let's dive into it now. Go for it.
Yeah, my book really relies on the premise that there are, 4 fundamental pillars to payments that everybody should be able to have the fundamental ability to pay. And particularly in crypto, it provides a mechanism for the unbanked and underbanked to be able to pay. And that is a really, really important. There's 1.4 billion people who don't have access to a bank account, but they have access to a phone or to a computer, right? That is a game changer. I think choice is another fundamental pillar. People like to choose what to pay with. If Josh agrees to give me legal advice in exchange for my pocketbook, setting aside any of her firm rules, that is payment, right? That is a private transaction that we've agreed to. And people like to pay with credit cards, checks, cash, tap and pay, WeChat wallets, all these types of things. And so if people want to pay with crypto, my belief is that they should be able to pay with crypto. I think another fundamental pillar is efficiency. Transactions, particularly in our banking system, are not efficient because the rails on which these financial transactions were built are very antiquated. And blockchain provides new rails. It's actually very, very transparent rails where you can transact, they're pseudonymous, not anonymous. So you can trace the transactions, but most importantly, they're efficient. And lastly, the final pillar I talk about is security and privacy. And blockchain based payments really are more secure and more private than your regular payments. I mean, we've seen so many hacks of credit card and other type of data, and again, it's more secure and private. And really, what I say in the book is, this may not be something that a company is ready to do today. We're at a very small percentage of adoption of crypto payment transactions. But the analogy I like to use is, if you were walking into Blockbuster in 1999 and you thought that was the only way you were ever going to rent a movie, you were wrong.
Yeah.
Right? Because now there are no more Blockbusters, and we stream movies. And so just thinking about what the future of finance and the future of payments looks like, my message is just pay attention, right? Or dip your toe, or consider it. Or if your engineer or product developer comes to you and says, hey, I have this great idea about accepting crypto payments, just listen with an open mind.
Yeah. Michelle, for the record, she would take your luxury bag and add it to her luxury collection. I'm sure Josh would be very, very happy to do that. Michelle, I want to dive into that a little bit, and Josh, I want to pull you into that as well, because we don't talk about payments often enough. Michelle, you and I had this conversation several days ago, and it really is an important topic. I had the privilege of presenting and talking about blockchain several years ago, and talked about payments and the unbanked and underbanked. And there's certain, globally, there are 1.4 billion, I think you said, that don't have access to the services that the three of us, for example, expect on a day-to-day basis. The other thing that was fascinating as I did the research, and I'd love you to weigh in on this, is that's not just far away, right? That's happening in America. There are Americans, for example, or Europeans who don't have access to these same services. Can you speak to that a little bit, like the global impact of having access to those services?
Yeah, I mean, I think a really good example of understanding in the US and even in New York, where the three of us are, about lack of access to bank accounts or credit cards, is the fact that every time you walk into a Van Leeuwen ice cream shop, there is an ATM machine, because Van Leeuwen does not accept cash. But according to New York State, you can't discriminate against purchasers who don't have credit cards or don't have a mobile payment. And so Van Leeuwen was required to have a machine at their ice cream stores that allows you to put cash in and receive, basically a gift card back to pay. And so this is a problem everywhere, but it's also a problem for international remittances. We are used to transacting 24/7, 365. But our banks and financial institutions are not open 24/7, 365.
Yeah, Michelle, great point. Josh, let's tear up the script a little bit and move on. We certainly spent a little bit of time talking about the markets, and as we discuss some of those items, the thing that really keeps driving the dialogue, and shout out to our friend David, he and I chat about this often, is the growth of spot Bitcoin ETFs. And I think, if I recall correctly, and for everyone in the audience, forgive me if I'm messing up the numbers, I think the BlackRock ETF is now up to something on the order of $10 billion. So we're looking at dozens of billions of dollars pouring in at an institutional basis. And we saw in the news as well, I think Morgan Stanley now considering making the ETF available on their brokerage platform, which is ginormous and a huge market impact. Again, I know you're both attorneys, don't focus on the markets particularly, but all of this is good news. Do you see this kind of building out further? And what do you think needs to happen? Where do we go next here? Josh, do you want to throw in some opinion about that? And again, not investment advice, and I won't ask you to predict the price of Bitcoin.
Sure. I mean, to me, yes, this is positive movement. This is what we've been waiting for, for mainstream and
Years.
big traditional finance to come into the water and play. So yeah, I think it's all good moves. I have to correct the record though, Ron. I gave up purses along with heels during the pandemic. So
Got it. Sorry.
I don't have a stockpile of purses, high-end purses. But yeah, I mean, where do we go to next? Well, I'm really excited to see what's going to happen with, further down the line with the ETH the proposed ETH spot ETF. Certainly, we've seen some developments with that, but I think this is something that's going to be unfolding over time.
And if I saw correctly, the decision on ETH ETF's been postponed on one of the applications. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, and that gets the SEC to what point down the road? How much longer do they have? Does anyone know? I don't know. I'm sorry. I haven't looked it up yet. I think it's something on the order of 3 months or something.
I've not looked it up, but if the past is any indication of the future, time frames are not always strictly adhered to.
Fair point. And, while we do spend a lot of time talking about the SEC, I do want to point out when we look at the news, the chair of the CFTC came out very recently in the past 2 or 3 days saying Congress needs to act on some of this. Michelle, what did you take out of that kind of conversation? There's this adversarial regulators say crypto, but we actually have regulators saying you got to do something.
Yeah, I thought it was a strong and unequivocal statement. I also thought it was effective in the sense that it was paired with a comparison to the other international jurisdictions. I believe he mentioned the EU, the UK, Singapore, Hong Kong, and he said 3 years ago, those jurisdictions did not have robust regulations, but now they do. And we have not moved toward any sort of clarity in that same 3 years. And I thought if Congress did not receive that message, nothing could be more clear that capital is being moved and being deployed overseas. I would say at least half of my practice is helping US-based businesses expand overseas because the market have clarity and it's quite frankly easier to know what you can and can't do.
Right. Michelle, thanks. Josh, did you see it the same way? We've chatted about the CFTC and other regulators as well.
So I agree with Michelle. I think also I'm just cognizant of time. I know there were a few limits today in terms of timing, but one thing I also just wanted to mention, and this may be completely unrelated to the Shapeshift announcement, but you may have seen the announcement this week about the SEC broadening the definition of dealer.
Yes.
And it's very interesting that the Shapeshift cease and desist focused exclusively on the dealer question.
That's a really good point. Earlier this week, we had the privilege of doing our monthly policy update. Shout out to Adam Goldberg and Dina Ellis, who participated. The video should be live, should be on YouTube now for those, and those conversations around changes to these rules really are impactful across a whole bunch of different ecosystems, including crypto, Josh. So thank you so much for raising that. We're just about out of time, a little bit of a shortened session today. What are you both looking forward to in the coming week? What will you be focusing on? Michelle, before you get on the Gulf Stream to head out for the weekend, what will you be thinking about? And tell people where they can learn more about you and get the book as well.
Sure. So you can get the book on Amazon. Just look me up, Michelle Gitlitz, Reimagining Payments. Where can people find me? At my firm, Arcturus PLLC. What am I looking forward to this week? I've spent this past week hearing about so many interesting new product features and integrations, and I'm really excited about what I'm seeing. The builders build and domestic builders. And I just continue to encourage them to build and we can help you, find a path here and overseas.
Michelle, thanks for being here. It was great to have you.
Thank you.
You've got to come back. Josh, what's your week looking like? And I know the answer immediately is busy. I'm with you. Just curious about what you'll be focusing on in the coming days.
Busy, I would say, is an understatement. So I think, as Michelle said, things have been busy, but things have really accelerated. So there's a lot of different client-related activities that that are requiring analysis. I'm not sure how much outside reading and things like that I will be doing in the next week.
Just trying to fit meals and coffee into the schedule. Thank you both. So I'm going to be spending a little bit of time doing the reading that we often talk about. I'm also looking at something interesting. It's more markets focused. But if I recall some of the research, some of the oldest wallets holding Bitcoin have begun to move, which is interesting when you look at Bitcoin at all-time highs. And we're giving the thought to what does this do for prices. Are they moving them on exchange, which is generally a sell indicator? Also looking at some of the news on some of the economic activity. We had payroll numbers this morning. It's always difficult to understand what will or won't be revised, but it's interesting to track how Bitcoin and other cryptos are impacted by the macroeconomics of the world we live in. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, Bitcoin and crypto was so tiny, it wasn't worth any regulator's time. It wasn't worth the government's time. Now they're tracking macroeconomic trends. And then finally, I'm going to finally look at ChatGPT. So wish me luck, ladies. Thank you both for joining us. Michelle, as always, great to see you. For those in the audience, thank you for joining us. If we didn't get a chance to get to some of your comments, if you've got comments for Michelle or Josh, email us, info@wsba.co. We will see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.